In the final days of World War II, as the smoke of Berlin's ruins drifted into the grey spring sky, the victors walked through the shattered remains of Hitler's empire, not as conquerors, but as witnesses to unimaginable horror. What they saw inside those camps, those basements, those fields of ash, would burn itself into the soul of a generation. The Soviet soldiers who entered Auschwitz, Treblinka, and Majdanek weren't the same men who left home in 1941. They had buried their brothers under frozen soil, watched villages turned to dust, and seen families slaughtered by men wearing the black uniform of the Waffen SS. To them, the SS wasn't just Hitler's army, it was evil made flesh. And when the war ended, the Red Army's vengeance didn't. It merely changed form. While the world celebrated peace, the Soviet Union began its own quiet campaign, a campaign not of politics or reconstruction, but of retribution. For the NKVD, Stalin's ruthless secret police, the war wasn't over. It had simply gone underground. Throughout the collapsing ruins of the Third Reich, thousands of SS men tried to disappear. Some burned their papers and uniforms, others swapped identities with ordinary soldiers. Many fled west, hoping to surrender to the Americans or British, knowing that capture by the Soviets meant a fate worse than death. But the Soviets had a long memory and an even longer reach. What began as battlefield revenge soon evolved into a systematic hunt, a manhunt that would last nearly 40 years. They called it the Payback. In the first months after victory, Soviet intelligence flooded the occupied zones of Eastern Europe with agents. Their orders were simple: find the men of the Waffen SS and erase them. Some were rounded up and executed in forests far from the eyes of the West. Others were dragged before Soviet tribunals in hastily arranged trials that lasted minutes. For every village burned, for every mother killed, there had to be a reckoning. But this was no clean justice. It was vengeance, raw, brutal, and personal. In cities like Riga, Kiev, and Minsk, former collaborators were paraded through the streets before being shot. Entire families of suspected SS officers disappeared overnight, and behind every name crossed off a Soviet list, there was a quiet satisfaction, a grim belief that balance had been restored. Still, Stalin wanted more than revenge. He wanted control. And so the hunt continued, into the West, into the new world of intelligence, politics, and espionage. As Europe rebuilt, the NKVD transformed into the KGB, and their files on former SS officers grew thicker each year. Many of those men had escaped justice by joining the very forces that now opposed the Soviets. In West Germany, in the CIA, even in NATO, ex-SS officers found new lives, their pasts hidden, their crimes forgotten. To Moscow, this was the ultimate insult, and the hunt entered a darker phase. From East Berlin to Buenos Aires, Soviet operatives tracked fugitives who thought they were safe. They infiltrated expatriate networks, intercepted letters, and sent coded orders to agents living under false names. Some targets were kidnapped and taken to Moscow for interrogation. Others simply vanished, their deaths disguised as accidents or suicides. This wasn't about trials anymore. It was about sending a message. No one escapes Soviet justice. By the 1950s, the Payback operation had grown into a shadow war within the Cold War. The same intelligence networks used to spy on the West were now being used to locate ghosts of the Third Reich. And in the Kremlin, each report that an SS man had been found was met with quiet approval, a signature from a faceless general, and another life erased. But vengeance has a cost. Many of those accused were not guilty of war crimes at all, merely soldiers who wore the wrong uniform. Families in Eastern Europe lived in fear, unsure when a knock on the door would come. In the name of justice, the Soviet machine devoured thousands who were never part of Hitler's terror. And yet, for those who had witnessed the massacre of their homeland, there was no pity, only memory and rage. By the end of the 1950s, the hunt had become institutional. Soviet agents began exchanging information with sympathetic contacts in Eastern Bloc governments, creating one of the largest man-tracking operations in modern history. Their reach stretched from Poland to Prague, from East Germany to the Siberian gulags. It was as if Stalin himself had sworn that the ghosts of the SS would never rest. And even as new generations were born and Europe entered the atomic age, the Soviets continued to look back into the fire and blood of 1945, searching for faces they could never forget. Because to them, this wasn't just revenge, it was redemption. As Europe rebuilt from the ashes, the world's attention shifted to a new conflict, the Cold War. But beneath the surface of nuclear tension and political speeches, an invisible war raged on. It wasn't fought with armies, but with files, with names, with memories, and the Soviets were still hunting ghosts. For the NKVD, now reformed as the KGB, the mission of vengeance had become a permanent institution. Deep within the grey buildings of Lubyanka, clerks typed up reports, updating dusty files that bore the insignia of the Waffen SS. Every name represented a man who had once stood against the Red Army, and to the Soviets, that was reason enough to be hunted. Some of those men had found new lives in West Germany, protected by the emerging government and by Western intelligence agencies. To Washington and London, the SS wasn't the enemy anymore. Communism was. And many of the men who had once fought the Soviets were now seen as useful allies. It was a cynical trade. The enemy of my enemy becomes my friend. But to Moscow, it was an unforgivable betrayal. In secret rooms across Eastern Europe, Soviet intelligence officers gathered at long tables, studying black and white photographs. The faces stared back, older, heavier, sometimes smiling, but always familiar. Each was marked with a red stamp, located, and beside it another order, scrawled in ink, eliminate. By the 1960s, the Payback operation had spread far beyond Europe. South America became a new hunting ground. In Buenos Aires, Santiago, and São Paulo, former SS officers lived quietly among German expatriate communities. They believed the Soviets would never find them there, but the KGB had agents in every port, every embassy, every shipping line. They watched, waited, and when the moment came, they struck. Some were taken alive, others weren't so lucky. A retired colonel was found dead in a hotel room in Argentina, heart attack, the papers said. Another was found drowned off the coast of Chile. No one asked questions, no one wanted to know, and Moscow didn't need to take credit. It was enough to know the past hadn't been forgotten. Still, not every hunt ended in blood. Some became psychological. The KGB began sending anonymous letters, photographs, and forged documents to former SS men, reminders that their past was not as buried as they thought. Men who had lived peacefully for 20 years began looking over their shoulders again, fearing footsteps in the night. Some took their own lives, others vanished, abandoning everything, as if running from ghosts, and in a way, they were. But vengeance has a way of consuming its masters. Inside the Soviet Union, paranoia spread. As the hunt expanded, suspicion turned inward. Were all the collaborators really found? Had some infiltrated the system? Could there be former Nazis working within Soviet territories, hidden under false names? The machinery of retribution began devouring itself. Thousands of innocent civilians were accused of being former SS members or Nazi sympathizers. Old men were dragged from their homes, interrogated, and sent to labor camps without evidence. For Stalin's successors, the hunt had become more than justice. It was a convenient weapon of fear, and yet among the chaos there were those who genuinely sought truth. Soviet historians, military officers, and investigators who wanted to document what had happened, to prove that the horrors of the Eastern Front had meaning. They collected testimonies, letters, and diaries from survivors, building secret archives that told the true story of Nazi occupation. These archives, buried deep within Soviet vaults, would one day reveal the full scale of destruction that had driven this endless revenge. By the late 1970s, the original hunters were gone, but their mission lived on in the hands of a new generation of KGB officers. They no longer spoke of the Payback as an operation. It was now a tradition, a quiet duty passed down like a curse. The war that had ended in 1945 still burned inside them, carried like an inheritance of hate. Some began to question it. Younger officers, born long after the war, asked, "When does revenge end?" But the old guard had only one answer: when every ghost is gone. In 1978, a former SS officer living under a false name in East Germany was discovered by chance. He had worked as a translator, lived quietly, paid his taxes, and for decades, no one suspected who he really was. When the KGB found out, there was no trial. He simply disappeared. His file was stamped closed, and just like that, one more ghost was erased from history. But outside the Iron Curtain, stories began to surface. Western journalists started uncovering evidence of Soviet assassinations, secret trials, and missing persons linked to the Waffen SS. The truth was leaking out, and it threatened to expose one of the most secretive campaigns of the Cold War. In Moscow, the leadership debated whether to continue. The world had changed. The Soviet Union was aging, its empire cracking. But to end the hunt now would mean admitting the past was never truly avenged. So the files remained, the lists stayed active, and the ghosts of the Waffen SS kept running, even as time itself began to run out. Because for the Soviets, revenge wasn't an act, it was a legacy. By the dawn of the 1980s, the world was changing faster than the Kremlin could control. The Cold War had reached its twilight, and yet, deep inside the decaying Soviet bureaucracy, a handful of men still carried the torch of vengeance lit 4 decades earlier. They were no longer soldiers or even spies in the traditional sense. They were archivists, investigators, ghosts themselves. But they had one mission left: finish the payback. For 40 years, the Soviet Union had lived under the shadow of its own rage. The first generation of hunters, the veterans of Stalingrad and Kursk, were dying off. Their sons now filled the same offices in Lubyanka, reading the same old files their fathers had once stamped top secret. Most of those files were yellowed, frayed at the edges, filled with names that no longer meant anything to anyone but them. But to these men, each page was sacred. Every record of an SS officer, every witness statement, every faded photograph, it was a wound that could never close. They knew that many of the men they were hunting were already dead. Some had died in exile, others of old age, their crimes buried with them. But that didn't matter. For the Soviets, vengeance was never about killing a man. It was about ensuring his memory never found peace. Across Eastern Europe, the last remnants of the old intelligence networks still functioned like rusted machinery. In East Berlin, a small KGB office maintained contact with former agents who once infiltrated Nazi escape routes. From time to time, new information surfaced. A letter intercepted, a rumor in a veterans club, a photograph found in an old passport file. Every scrap was investigated. Every ghost pursued, even if the trail led nowhere. But by now, the purpose had blurred. Was it still about justice, or had it become an obsession, a ritual to give meaning to the Soviet system itself? Inside the KGB, whispers grew that the payback was no longer just a manhunt. It was a symbol of power. To admit it was over would be to admit that the Soviet Union no longer controlled history. In 1983, one of the last active operations targeted a small group of former SS officers living quietly in Austria. The KGB's files described them as war criminals who escaped Western trials. But the truth was murkier. Most of them were old, frail, and forgotten. Still, the Soviets sent a team. They tracked them through surveillance, intercepted calls, and even bribed a local police officer to confirm their identities. But before they could act, the story leaked to the Western press. For the first time, journalists printed the phrase, "The Soviet Payback Files." The Kremlin panicked. This was never supposed to be public. Decades of secrecy risked unraveling in a single headline. To protect their image, Soviet officials denied everything. The hunters were ordered to stand down, but in private, the orders continued. Old habits die hard, and vengeance doesn't stop with politics. In the same year, a young officer named Yuri, barely 30, stumbled across an aging archive in the basement of a KGB building. There he found a collection of forgotten case files dating back to 1945. Each was marked unresolved. Yuri began reading them one by one. As he turned to the pages, he realized he wasn't reading about monsters or soldiers. He was reading about time itself. Entire lifetimes of pursuit, revenge, and loss, written in typewriter ink that was now fading into history. Something changed in him. He saw how the line between justice and vengeance had vanished long ago. And for the first time in 4 decades, someone inside the Soviet machine began to ask, what if forgiveness is the only way to end a war that never ended? But forgiveness was a dangerous word in the Soviet Union. It was weakness, and weakness could get you erased. Meanwhile, outside those walls, the world was shifting. Germany was reuniting. The Berlin Wall was cracking. And for the first time, Soviet citizens were beginning to learn what had been done in their name. Declassified files leaked through underground journalists revealed the scope of the payback: kidnappings, secret executions, and the quiet erasure of thousands of men, some guilty, some not. The international reaction was mixed. In the West, some called it Soviet terror. In the East, others called it delayed justice. But for the men inside the system, the truth was simpler. It had never been about right or wrong. It had always been about memory. By 1989, as the Soviet Union stood on the edge of collapse, the payback officially ceased to exist. The last remaining files were sealed in a classified vault under the Ministry of State Security. Many were later destroyed. Others were quietly sold to private collectors or smuggled into the West. And yet, despite the fall of the empire that created it, the legacy of that 40-year hunt refused to die. Because for every ghost they erased, a story remained. For every name they crossed out, a memory survived. And those memories, carried by the survivors and their families, would outlive the Soviet Union itself. When the last Soviet flag was lowered in 1991, the men who once hunted in its name disappeared into the crowd, old, forgotten, unrecognized. Some still believed they had served justice. Others knew they had only prolonged the war in another form. But all of them carried the same question to their graves. Can vengeance ever end if history refuses to forget? When the Soviet Union fell in 1991, the red flags were lowered, the statues of Lenin crumbled, and an empire built on fear and pride came to an end. But deep inside forgotten archives, in rooms sealed with dust and silence, boxes of yellowed files still sat untouched. Names, photographs, and reports from a war that had ended half a century earlier. They were all that remained of the payback. For 40 years, the Soviet Union had hunted the men of the Waffen SS, but what began as revenge had become something else entirely. It was now history's unfinished chapter, too painful to reopen and too significant to ignore. As Russia and the former Soviet states transitioned into a new era, fragments of those secret operations began to surface. Declassified KGB documents revealed details that stunned even seasoned historians. Entire networks dedicated solely to tracking Nazi fugitives, secret prisons that operated under false names, and decades of surveillance stretching from Eastern Europe to South America. But what shocked people most wasn't the scale, it was the obsession. The documents showed that long after most of the hunted men were dead, the Soviets still kept the operation alive. They didn't want to stop. because to stop meant accepting that vengeance could never truly balance the horror of the past. In interviews that surfaced in the 1990s, former KGB officers spoke anonymously about the hunt. One said, "We weren't chasing men, we were chasing ghosts. We wanted to silence what we couldn't forget." Another admitted that by the 1980s, most of the targets were already in their 70s, harmless, but orders were orders. He paused before saying, "We called it justice, but in truth, it was grief." Outside Russia, Western historians tried to reconstruct what had really happened. In Germany, newly opened Stasi archives revealed cooperation between East German security forces and the KGB. In Argentina and Chile, local police records hinted at disappearances that matched Soviet files. And across Europe, families who had long wondered about vanished relatives began to realize the truth. They had been caught in a war that never truly ended. But not every story was one of death and secrecy. Some were stories of reckoning. In 1994, a former Soviet archivist named Elena Petrova discovered a hidden collection of resolved case files from the Payback. Inside were letters, hundreds of them, written by Soviet officers who had participated in the early hunts. Many of them expressed regret. One line found in a letter never meant to be read captured the entire tragedy of the operation. "We became what we hated because hate was all we had left." That single sentence echoed through the halls of modern history. It forced scholars to question the very nature of vengeance, whether it could ever be pure or whether it always corrupts those who wield it. As the 2000s arrived, documentaries, interviews, and academic studies began to uncover the true scope of the Payback. For the first time, the world began to see it not only as a Soviet operation, but as a human story of pain, rage, and the inability to let go. The line between justice and revenge had blurred beyond recognition, leaving behind only shadows. And yet, there were those who still believed it had to happen. To them, the Payback wasn't a crime, it was a grim necessity. A way to remind the world that evil must always be answered, even if the answer destroys the one who gives it. In modern Russia, the legacy of the hunt remains complex. Some view it as a dark stain on Soviet history, a campaign of unchecked power born from trauma. Others see it as an inevitable reaction to unimaginable suffering. And somewhere between those two truths lies the real story. A nation scarred so deeply that it couldn't stop fighting even after victory. Today, historians estimate that the Soviet Union tracked and captured over 30,000 individuals suspected of SS involvement between 1945 and 1989. Thousands were executed, many more vanished without record, and perhaps millions lived their lives haunted, not by guilt, but by fear. The story of the Payback isn't one of good versus evil. It's a mirror showing how the thirst for retribution can survive longer than the war itself. It asks a question no victory parade can answer. When the enemy is gone, what do we do with the hate they leave behind? As the camera fades to black, imagine those abandoned Soviet files lying silent in the dark. Inside them, the ghosts of both the hunted and the hunters whisper through the dust,
the German onslaught was checked,
for forgiveness,
and Paris
but for
was saved.
remembrance. Because
That
history
comparatively
doesn't
unknown
forget,
general later
it
became
waits,
commander-in-chief
it watches,
of all
and
the Allied
sometimes
armies
it hunts back.
and presided